is Vantage Point, and you're joining me, Stephanie Lazarus, and this is where we give you information that you need every other week, and we will be bringing different dimensions of developing stories that have been seen and that has appeared on your newspaper every day. So joining me in conversation today is Dr. Jayatilaka.
Hi Stephanie.
Very good evening to you, and we are seeing you after a very long break.
Yeah, a couple of weeks. My wife and I were away in China, in Beijing and Shanghai, on invitation, and that explains the outfit.
The outfit. Well, since you spoke about China, I think that is to do with our international relations, and something that I have lined up. And the economics as well, and that's something that I've lined up later on to speak about later on in the program. But first up, let's speak about a pressing issue in the country, that is a VAT. Well, the government says that it's going to announce what the essential items are going to be, and it's going to separate the essential items from non-essential items. First up, I would like to ask you as to why the government wants to come up with this announcement now, whereas this should have been made right before the amendment itself. And how exactly do you think is the government going to separate the essential items from non-essential items while discussing about this with the Consumer Affairs Authority? How is the government going to get about this?
Quite right, Stephanie. I mean, why on earth didn't they figure this out before? I mean, if they can do it now, they could have done it before. I think the whole VAT issue has an interesting dimension. That is the so-called VAT hartas, the shutdown by small and medium traders, businessmen. Now, those businessmen are usually the support base of the UNP, but they've gone on strike, and it's been a rolling campaign from Kandy to Ampara. You know, it's pretty big. So why did the UNP get itself in this mess in the first place? The answer was glimpsed by me in a very interesting article written by one of our top economists, Dr. Dushne Virako. She'd written a piece on the IMF package for the Institute of Policy Studies webpage. I read it in the mainstream press. Now, she's very independent, she's a professional, she's not against the IMF package, more or less comes down on the side that it was kind of inevitable. But she traces the problem. The problem was, okay, we had a debt problem, but as she says or admits, things kept going so long as we had external inflows. But the external inflows dropped sharply. When did they drop sharply? 2015. So, it's not as Ravi Karunanayaka says, you know, Mahinda Rajapaksa and debt. Yes, there was that issue, but that was taken care of because there were these huge inflows coming in. But in 2015, the inflows dropped. Therefore, you had a gap, and the shortfall had to be made up with an IMF program which contained the VAT hike. Okay. Now, what happened in 2015? The government unplugged from China. That's what happened. I mean, the Chinese economy has done something that you don't find in international economic history. That's 3 decades of sustained high growth without a crash. And the upliftment, the increasing prosperity of 1.4 billion people. So we were plugged in to that energy. And then the UNP unplugged. Now it's trying desperately to plug in again. And the Chinese are saying, okay, fine, but you know, on the same terms. That's very clear. But in that period where it's like you unplug from a big motor or generator or a life support machine or something, it has a cost. With the drop in external inflows, you had a crisis, And in order to manage the crisis, the government went to the IMF, and the IMF has a kind of a textbook or playbook, and that's how the VAT spike happened. So it was avoidable, it was not unavoidable. Now Dr. Veerakon's article, which as I said is not anti-IMF by any chance, but it says something even more serious. She says that with the implementation of the IMF package, you will see a depression in the real income of households. In other words, the money that our households have won't be worth what it used to be worth. So you're really talking about the opposite of prosperity.
So is this?
So that's going to be a serious problem for the government, Stephanie, when the IMF program moves even beyond VAT to the next phases. There's going to be a serious problem. It's not going to be just the traders who shut down.
And is it part of the IMF conditionalities of cutting public funding, funds per se?
You know, there are a number of things which are going to be problematic. One is the exchange rate, so the value of the rupee is going down. 2, public expenditure. 3, relatedly, the shrinkage of the state sector, which means there will be layoffs, which means there will be less income. 4, what the package itself terms a fundamental reset of economic policy almost entirely towards export, which means domestic purchasing power becomes less important, which means it really doesn't matter whether the Sri Lankans have that much money or not, because we're aiming for the export market.
But we've
and finally, electricity and fuel hikes, which are going to drive prices up. So prices are going to be driven up, but real incomes are going down, and if the last couple of weeks are anything to go by, people are not going to take it lying down.
Well, speaking about Parliament, well, there's a report that really took all of us by storm, that is a shadow cabinet of the joint opposition, which was unprecedented, which has never happened in the history of the country, I reckon. Where
it has, but that's okay.
Yeah, but not officially, as in as of recently, this is the first time I've heard of it, as in
before your lifetime, the LSSP had a shadow cabinet, and they named, Dr. N. Pereira, Corbynat, and so on.
Has the opposition had?
Yeah, when they were in opposition.
But I think by the announcement, when they announced what the role and the objective of this is, they mentioned that this was like a training session.
Yeah, they're not sure whether it's a shadow cabinet or not.
Yes, and do you think that the joint opposition has really got their role mixed up in this whole?
No, Stephanie, I think it's more serious than that. Well, if there's going to be a shadow cabinet, that's okay, but you've got to get its profile right. Here the problem is that the profile of the shadow was all wrong. And then they say it's not a shadow cabinet, it's a, monitoring mission or monitoring task force. Well, if that's all it was, why did former President Rajapaksa resign? I mean, he pulled out of the shadow cabinet. And he says the shadow cabinet, he joked and said it stands dissolved when the Prime Minister resigns, which is in a way true. I mean, the shadow PM resigned. So is it a shadow cabinet or isn't it? Was it right or was it wrong? Why did he resign? Frankly, I don't think he should have resigned, because he's the obvious choice. If you need a shadow cabinet, he's the obvious choice for shadow Prime Minister. So why resign? No, I think quite frankly, Stephanie, the shadow cabinet / monitoring task force, as well as the chatter from some smaller parties in the opposition about Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, shows that the opposition hasn't quite corrected itself, and it hasn't changed to the point that it is perceived as suitable to take over power and form a government at this moment. Now, it's very good as a counterweight. There's a lot of mass support there. There's a lot of dynamism. But what was really wrong with the profile of the shadow cabinet? Too many Rajapaksas in the wrong places. So the issue of nepotism or family monopoly or a family oligarchy has not been corrected to the degree that it should have been. 3 Rajapaksas and a young Rajapaksa being given so serious a task as foreign policy, surely that should have gone to Dinesh or Dallas. Now I know Namal is interested in foreign policy, but maybe there should have been a group of younger MPs, Namal, Ramesh Patran and Tarak Balasuriya, all 3 of whom are interested in foreign policy and quite smart. But you know, he can't be the only guy who's handling foreign policy. None of which means that arresting him at this time was a smart thing to do. That's something else altogether. I think the criticism that was building up about the shadow cabinet got completely deleted with this dramatic arrest. So that I think was dumb. But the shadow cabinet shows that the joint opposition hasn't yet got its act together.
Is it because there is very low confidence that's placed in the opposition itself, the main opposition?
No, I think that if there's an election, they'll do well. That's why they keep challenging this. They keep saying, hey, come on, let's have an election. There'll be a protest vote. And furthermore, if there's a referendum on the Constitution, I think it'll be like in Britain, where both Prime Minister Cameron and the opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn of Labour called for a Remain vote, but the people voted against. So I think this joint opposition is perfectly capable of defeating even a Ranil Chandrika call for a federal constitution. So no, I don't think that the joint opposition is losing support. I think it's gaining support. But I don't think it has yet got the swing vote, that is, those who are sitting on the fence, floating or new. Because those people are looking for a different kind of Sri Lanka. There's a lot of criticism of the government, but there's applause, including from the joint opposition, except for 2 personalities, about the appointment of Dr. Kumaraswamy. So people want merit to be the criterion. And it didn't look like merit was the primary criterion in the naming of the shadow cabinet. So there you are. You have a crisis of government and you have a crisis of the opposition as well.
Well, since you mentioned about the arrest of the former first son, former President Mahinda Rajapaksa had made a statement saying that it was in fact political revenge. Do you think that it is a good enough statement that should be made by a former president, given that the verdict itself was issued by the court, by the judicial system? And do you think the former president, by doing so, by giving a statement such as that, is insulting the judicial system of the country?
Well, Stephanie, firstly, there was no verdict. I mean, the case has not even begun. And the judge did say that there is insufficient reason to deny Nama Rajapaksa bail, and that he is being denied bail and held only because there is the point that witnesses could be intimidated, and therefore he is going to be locked up rather than bailed out. But on the surface of it, there is no reason why he shouldn't have been granted bail, says the judge. So that's one thing. The second thing, it's, you know, can this, look at the timing. I mean, you know, the joint opposition is supposed to march from Kandy, and then this guy gets locked up. there's a bit of a question mark. I mean, the why now question mark.
But can't it just be coincidence?
Well, it could be coincidence, except for what happened 30 years ago. 30 years ago, under UNP government, a young SLFP MP at the time, Mahinda Rajapaksa, was locked up. Shortly after the Mulkirikala by-election, in which the UNP used a lot of coercion, Chamar Rajapaksa was the candidate, Mahinda was the main organizer. The UNP won, but very narrowly, and overriding the better judgment of a very gentlemanly UNP minister of that area, Ranjit Athapattu of Beliyatta, a young UNP cabinet minister insisted that a lesson be taught to the Rajapaksas and that Mahinda be locked up. So Mahinda was taken away in handcuffs, and the charge was murder. It was UNP government, but of course the charges were eventually dismissed because it was bogus. But Mahinda Rajapaksa had to attend his mother's funeral in handcuffs. The UNP cabinet minister who pushed for his arrest would eventually become prime minister, but not rise higher than that. But Mahinda Rajapaksa, 20 years after being taken away in handcuffs, was the president of Sri Lanka. So it almost seems an action replay. UNP government, the same UNP personality who wanted Mahinda locked up, very much in power today, and Mahinda Rajapaksa's son gets locked up. I don't know whether 20 years later, this is going to help young Nama, but it seems too much of a pattern. And under that same government, the UNP government, I remember, just before a referendum of December 82, they locked up Vijay Kumar Tumbe. And Osiya Begunasekara was also locked up. So, the UNP does have, or this UNP, does have a tendency to lock up political opponents, especially younger ones,
But right now,
just before some important oppositional event.
But before we wrap up, I think we should wrap up this edition of Vantage Point on a very positive note. Well, Sri Lanka has been named and positioned itself as the world's second country to have a very peaceful internal process going on, and this is something that should be commended, and there should be a lot of appreciation for this effort that is undertaken by Sri Lanka. Well, do you think that we do deserve a little bit of credit, especially in the international arena, because Sri Lanka has come a long way when it comes to internal peace and maintaining that peace? What would you like to say, Dr. Dayan?
Well, I think we've done well, and one of the reasons we've done well is because we defeated the Tigers. I mean, if we hadn't defeated the Tigers outright, you would have had the same situation that you find when you look around the world on your news every day.
But don't you think the process after that is the most challenging process? That is to maintain the same peace and keep that reconciliation process.
Yeah, but
going.
many of the countries don't even have that same peace to maintain. There are terrorist bombs going off in Turkey. The airport, 40 people dead. There are bombs going off in Iraq, in Libya. New terrorist movements that have arisen. So I think the fact that Sri Lanka eliminated terrorism and has managed to keep the lid on so there's no reactivation of violence is what has helped us build the peace. Without that, we would have been like all these other places. And secondly, in terms of violence, look at the United States, the shootings of black kids, black shootings of policemen, this one guy who went, the sniper in Dallas. I mean, we don't have kids going in and shooting other school kids. And then take the Chilcot report, a war in which 150,000 Iraqis were killed and a country destroyed, and therefore terrorism unleashed throughout the Middle East, including now in the West, because ISIS came out after the Iraq war. a war based on false pretenses. And the British dare tell us that we should have an accountability mechanism with the international participation. Where is the accountability mechanism
but they did
for the Iraq war?
But they did have an investigation. They did have a tribunal to challenge.
There's no tribunal. Chilcot report is not a tribunal.
There were soldiers that were brought to, as in just in the
Londonderry. Who? Londonderry. They shot civilians who were going to church in 1972, Bloody Sunday. 2 reports, 2 commissions, took 38 years, and not a single soldier belonging to the paratroops was ever prosecuted. In fact, some of them got Queen's honours, not for shooting the people in Londonderry. But no, there are no tribunals. What has happened after Iraq? Where is the tribunal on Iraq? Who is Tony Blair going to be tried? He should be tried because obviously.
But don't you think Sri Lanka at least needs to allow that process as an inquiry?
Why should we do something when nobody else has done it? I think we should have trials which our own courts can undertake. Why should we have a special
tribunal? Why are we taking so much time in
why should we have a special tribunal?
Even a domestic process to say, why can't we take that into consideration?
Not a domestic process, no.
A domestic inquiry or a revamped or a
No, we have courts and there are soldiers in custody for crimes that they have committed. Let's implement the LLRC report. There are 8 or 10 incidents that have been mentioned, including Isipriya, the killing of Isipriya. Have a proper judicial inquiry through the AG's department with our lawyers and our courts and bring those guys to justice. I'm all for that. I've always been for that. But no special courts. Why special courts? Nuremberg was a special court because it was deemed that Hitler had committed crimes that humanity had never seen before, like putting 6 million Jews into gas chambers. What's the reason for special court in Sri Lanka? We have our existing courts. Murderers, rapists are all tried under those in those normal courts. Let the law take its course.
But do you think Sri Lanka will maintain the same sovereign position now, knowing that the president and the foreign minister are having contradictory statements about allowing an international inquiry?
Well, I think the foreign minister needs to familiarize himself with the Sri Lankan constitution. He said at a media briefing that the president has an opinion. In a democracy, even the head of state can have an opinion. What's the meaning of that? In any country, the head of state can have an opinion. In a dictatorship, the opinion of the head of state goes unchallenged. But what does he mean by even in a democracy, even the head of state can have an opinion? I mean, does that make sense to you? It does. It's nonsense. The statement is nonsense. And he says, well, the president has this opinion, the TNA has that opinion, and I'm sure we can find something in the middle. In the first place, that's not his job. In the second place, if he said the joint opposition has one opinion and the TNA has another opinion, that's okay. But you can't put the elected president, the executive, on the same level as the TNA or the JVP or any other political party. This is a presidential system. He's the head of state and head of government. The opinion of the president cannot be equated with the opinion of some small opposition party. I don't care if this is JVP or the TNA or even a big opposition party, like the JO. I mean, this guy hasn't read the constitution of Sri Lanka. How can he represent Sri Lanka? And it's certainly not his job to try to find an intermediate position between the TNA and the elected president of Sri Lanka. He has gone on to say that we'll have a special court in January, February 2017. Really? And who has agreed with him on this? The cabinet? The president? He said in Geneva, he and Mano Tittawala, that it will be a domestic mechanism, but the new court will have international participation. Where was that decided? By Parliament? I mean, I think just as Vimal Veeravansa went to court over the VAT, somebody should challenge all of this in court and push for a referendum, because this is a matter of sovereignty. Frankly, I think Mr. Samaraveera doesn't know the job of the foreign minister and the limits. Now, he's talked about demilitarizing not only the north and east of Sri Lanka, but the whole of Sri Lanka by 2018. That's not the job of a foreign minister. He can't even speak about it. What does he mean by demilitarization? I think that we will, before he demilitarizes Sri Lanka, you will find that the government demongolizes itself. Because if we continue this way, there will be a far more serious crisis than the central bank crisis or the VAT hartals over special courts and his promises on constitutional change made in Geneva without a mandate from the parliament. Zaid al-Hussein in his written report has these are numbered paragraphs. In one paragraph he says the government of Sri Lanka has promised whom, where, who made the promise? Promised that there will be a new constitution in 2017 or amendments in 2017 which will include international law into the constitution and permit international participation in a new judicial mechanism on accountability. Hey, who knows this? Does President Sirisena know it? It seems to be contrary to his stated views. Does the cabinet know it? Does the United National Party know it? Does Parliament know it? Or is it only Mangala Samaravira who knows this? I think that, quite frankly, either Dr. Sarat Amanugama or Sajid Premadasa or Mahinda Samarasinghe will have to replace Mr. Samaravira as Foreign Minister, just as Arjuna Mahendran had to be replaced by Dr. Kumaraswamy. And we shall have to take a look at these promises that have been unilaterally made by one person in Geneva behind the back of the Parliament and the government. And we shall have to renegotiate that resolution. It's perfectly possible.
Well, that brings us to the end of Vantage Point. And remember, if you want to comment, if you want to share your views, or even want some of your questions answered, you can mail us at newsfirst@maharaja.lk. And if you want to tweet, you can use our Twitter handle and follow us at newsfirst_en. I'm Stephanie Lazarus. It was nice having you. Have a good night.